They were found beneath the crabapple tree, hand in hand, as if sleep had taken them mid-embrace. Yet their throats were cut, and their eyes fixed wide to the heavens, as though some terrible thing had called them upward. It began, as many legends do, not in the moment of blood, but in the years before it, in whispers, in eyes that lingered too long in the dark, in letters passed beneath pews and secrets pressed between pages of hymnals. The year was 1922, but the rot had begun decades earlier, in the hush and shadow of another century. Reverend Edward Hall had the voice of a man born to be trusted. He spoke of grace with trembling hands and eyes like polished glass. He moved through St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church in New Brunswick, New Jersey, with a humility that looked rehearsed, and a smile that always seemed just a little too certain. Eleanor Mills, the wife of the church's sexton, sang in the choir with a voice that made the stained glass shiver. She was not beautiful in the way magazines dictated, but she had a vitality, an urgency about her, as though every breath she took might be her last. Her husband, James Mills, was quiet, devoted, and mostly invisible. The sort of man the world forgets even while he's still living in it. Their affair had been rumored long before it was discovered. They thought they were subtle. They were not. Love letters were passed like contraband, some in Edward's own hand, others clumsily burned or buried, only to surface like corpses bloated with guilt. In the pages he called her his soul's bride and promised to build a new life with her. She wrote of kisses stolen behind church walls, of longing that made her chest ache, of nights spent imagining a shared home, a shared future. But what kind of man leaves behind a wife like Frances Hall? Frances had the money, old money, the kind of money that came with silence and influence. Her family, the Stevens, owned half the city, or at least it felt that way. And when Edward married her, some said he did it for love, others knew better. On September 16, 1922, the sun never really rose. That morning, Edward Hall told Frances he was going to the church for a meeting. She nodded without asking questions, as she often did. He never returned. Later that night, Eleanor told her daughter she was stepping out for a walk. It was already past dusk. She never returned either. They were found the next day by two teenage boys picking grapes along the outskirts of town. The scene they stumbled upon would haunt them forever. The Reverend lay on his back beneath the gnarled branches of the crabapple tree. His glasses were still perched delicately on his face, unbroken. Eleanor was beside him, her body turned slightly toward his. Her throat had been slashed so violently her head was nearly severed. A scarf was tied around her neck as if to hide the horror. An absurd, pitiful gesture. Her tongue had been cut out. They had been arranged, placed, not discarded like waste, but presented, like an offering. The newspaper men descended like vultures. Within hours, the story swept across the country like wildfire laced with perfume. A priest and a parishioner, murdered in a lover's embrace. Secret notes, betrayal, money, revenge. The crime scene was trampled by reporters and locals alike, curious and cruel. People pocketed blades of grass, took soil samples, even snapped photographs of the corpses before the police arrived. Evidence was ruined, lost. The murder scene became a carnival. James Mills, broken and bewildered, said little. He worked in the shadows of the church, and now he moved through his grief like a ghost among the ruins. Frances Hall, however, was another matter entirely. When questioned, she was calm. Too calm. She sat with her gloved hands folded and gave the sort of answers that felt memorized. Her brother, Willie Stevens, was with her constantly, a strange, twitchy man who barked at reporters and wandered off mid-sentence, muttering about honor and family. Then the letters were found. Dozens of them. Some from Edward, some from Eleanor, and with them, rumors grew teeth. Why were they killed in such a theatrical way? Why cut out her tongue? Why leave his glasses untouched? Why arrange their bodies as though death had been choreographed? People began to talk. They said Frances had known, that she'd hired men to follow Edward, that her brothers had intercepted a note about a late-night meeting beneath the crabapple tree, that the family had tracked the lovers to the orchard, and then, under cover of night, the orchard had become a stage. A reckoning. No charges were filed, not for years. But justice does not sleep, even if it sometimes dreams strange dreams. In 1926, 4 years after the murders, a grand jury was convened. Frances Hall, along with her brothers Henry and Willie, were arrested and charged with the killings. The trial that followed was a circus. The defense painted Eleanor as a seductress, a social climber who sought to ruin a man of God. The prosecution pointed to motive, letters, timing. But evidence had long since decayed beneath the weight of curiosity and carelessness. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some swore they heard screams. Others claimed to have seen cars in the orchard. But no one had the full truth. And so, in the end, the jury acquitted them all. No one was ever convicted. But the whispers never stopped. There are those who say the orchard is cursed now, that on September nights, when the wind moves just so, you can hear a woman's voice singing a hymn with no words, her throat raw and broken. Some say the glasses still glint in the grass, that if you find them and look through them, you'll see the moment the knife falls, over and over again. The Hall Mills case was never about just one night. It was about the slow, patient rot of longing and guilt and entitlement. It was about the masks we wear for God and the faces we hide for ourselves. It was about how love, when denied, turns violent, and how silence, when inherited, becomes generational. New Brunswick never forgot. Not really. They just learned to say less about it. The church still stands. The pews are worn. The hymnal's newer now. But beneath the bell tower, if you listen closely, there's an echo, like the rustle of a skirt brushing past you in the dark, like the soft hush of a voice that once sang and now weeps, like the ghost of a kiss never given. And the crabapple tree? They cut it down. Said it was diseased. Said it had no place in God's garden. But roots are clever things, and some stains do not wash clean. There are towns that bury their sins beneath white fences and hymns. New Brunswick tried, but the orchard's shadow reached further than anyone dared admit. In the years following the trial, the Hall Mills murders became less a crime and more a story. A fable soaked in blood and scandal. Parents warned daughters not to linger after choir practice. Ministers watched their words more carefully. And yet, every few years, someone would bring up the letters. They were never destroyed. The press had copies. Neighbors passed them around folded in linen. Even school children whispered their contents beneath desks, mouths curling around words like soulmate and beloved. The intimacy of the notes, the fire of them, was too much for the town to forget. One in Edward's own hand read, "Tonight I look at the stars and wonder if you do the same, my Eleanor, my wife in everything but law. If I perish without you, it will not be death, but the unmaking of heaven." And she, not to be outdone, wrote back, "Say the word, Edward, and I shall burn my past. Say it, and I shall meet you at the tree, and we shall make a new Eden beneath its branches." That line, the tree, it stuck in the minds of many. Too perfect, too poetic. It felt like an invitation. Some said Eleanor chose that spot for its privacy. Others said it was symbolic, a tree of knowledge, a tree of sin, a tree of punishment. But not all symbols are metaphor. Some bear fruit long after the bodies are removed. There was a boy, years later, who swore he saw a woman kneeling beneath the stump where the crabapple once stood. She was weeping, he said, and her mouth was moving, but there was no sound. Just breath. Just the wind. When he approached, she vanished like ash. His parents told him it was a dream, but the orchard had its own memory, and dreams in places like this often tell the truth. Investigators returned now and then, each trying to solve what the others could not. They dusted old evidence, re-interviewed aging witnesses, dug through newspaper clippings yellowed by time. Yet nothing new ever came. The trail was too cold, the blood too dry. Still, there were things that never sat right. The fact that neither Edward nor Eleanor had defensive wounds. The way their bodies were posed, not just with care, but with knowledge of what would disturb the public most. Eleanor's tongue, removed with a surgical precision. The placement of Edward's hat neatly beside him. It was theater, carefully directed, painfully intimate. And what of the scarf? It didn't belong to either of them. It was silk, blue, and bore the faint scent of lilac water, a perfume favored by Frances Hall. When pressed, she claimed she'd lost it weeks earlier, but no one could prove otherwise. The jury didn't find that detail convincing, but the town did. After the acquittal, Frances withdrew. She stopped attending church. Rarely left her home, the curtains always drawn, the porch untouched by human presence. Her brothers disappeared from public life. Henry moved west. Willie grew more erratic, sighted at odd hours in the garden, muttering about judgment and the music of blood. No one questioned them anymore, not aloud. But at night the questions multiplied. Why had Edward's glasses remained perfectly in place? If there had been a struggle, why had no blood trail led away from the scene? Why had no one heard the cries? Or had they, and simply chosen silence? There was a maid years later who worked for the Hall family during the summer of the murders. She never testified, was never called. But on her deathbed, she spoke to her son in whispers. She said she heard Frances crying the night before the murder. Not softly, but with rage. Plates had shattered. A door slammed. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but the drawing back of a blade before the cut. She also said that Willie left that night carrying something wrapped in cloth. When he returned hours later, he was covered in orchard dust and didn't speak a word. Frances was already in bed, her hands folded, her eyes open. Of course, no record of this statement was ever filed. The son died in a fire 10 years later. A coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps this story doesn't like to be told. People began to say the tree had cursed the town, that since its felling, strange things happened. A choir girl went missing on her walk home one evening. She was found days later near the old orchard path, dazed, confused, with scratches down her arms and no memory of what had happened. A pastor collapsed mid-sermon when reciting the passage from John about truth setting one free. He said later he'd seen a vision of a man with glasses, his throat slit, his mouth moving soundlessly from the pews. And then there was the letter. Typed, anonymous, delivered to the city's small historical society in 1951. It read, "You ask who killed the Reverend and the lady beneath the tree. You think it was the wife, or the brothers, or a secret lover. But it was none of these. It was the church, not the building, no. But the idea, the mask, the lie that said such love must be hidden, punished, erased. They didn't die because of what they did. They died because of what they believed." The letter was unsigned. The envelope bore no return address. But it was placed into the archives, where it remains, tucked beside photographs too grainy to identify and transcripts too redacted to follow. Every town has its haunt. New Brunswick has this. A story that cannot be solved. A sin that cannot be named. And if you walk the old orchard trail on the anniversary of their deaths, some say the air turns cold. That a shape appears among the weeds. Two shapes, closer. Holding hands, looking up, waiting. Perhaps for justice, perhaps for forgiveness, perhaps only for the telling. And so we tell it, again and again. Not because we know the ending, but because the silence is worse. Because the silence in the end is what killed them. They were never buried together. That's the part no one talks about. Edward Hall lies in a private cemetery beneath a polished stone paid for by his widow. Frances spared no expense. Marble, gold lettering, a passage from Corinthians carved beneath his name, as though death might rewrite the life he lived. Eleanor Mills lies in Van Leeuw Cemetery, several miles away, marked by a modest headstone etched with weathered prayer. Her funeral was poorly attended. Her husband, James, never remarried. He spoke less and less over the years until one day he simply stopped speaking altogether. They weren't allowed the dignity of rest together. But death has a different kind of memory, and some say the graves speak to each other when the moon is right. It's a cruel irony, how the living separated them more thoroughly than death ever could. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the punishment was not the killing but the denial of peace. The letters, those cursed letters, continued to surface. People claimed to find them in attics, tucked inside hollowed Bibles, slipped between wallpaper and plaster like forgotten love notes left to rot. Some were fakes, some weren't. One, dated mere days before the murder, was never released to the public. It sat in the possession of a retired New Brunswick librarian named Harriet Green, who'd inherited it from her father, a policeman present at the original investigation. She kept it in a sealed box marked, "Do not open." She opened it only once, on a night when rain fell sideways and the power had gone out. She read the letter by candlelight. When morning came, her neighbors found her in her rocking chair, dead, the letter still gripped in her left hand. Her mouth was open. Her eyes were not. The letter read, "Forgive me, Eleanor. I cannot make them understand. They watch me now. Frances does not sleep. She walks the halls as though she waits for the end. I've prayed for courage, but I find only fear. If we meet again, let it be without masks. Let it be as souls." It was signed simply, E. The authorities found no foul play. Natural causes, they said, but no one touched the letter again. They buried it with her. Time moved forward. The world changed, but the Hall Mills case remained, untouched by progress, untouched by the dead. True crime enthusiasts revisited the case in the 1970s, then again in the 90s. There were books, radio specials, one poorly made television reenactment that turned the story into farce. But no matter how it was told, something was always missing. Because the story didn't live in transcripts or files. It lived in the space between facts, in the silence of things never said, and the silence always returned to one name, Frances Hall. She lived long after the acquittal, grew old in that creaking house with its lace curtains and locked doors. She refused interviews, refused church, refused even to attend Edward's grave. When she died in 1942, her obituary made no mention of the trial, but her final will did. She left behind a journal, not public, not printed, just 12 pages, cursive and faint. At first glance it seemed innocent, devotional quotes, domestic notes and recipes. But in the margins were phrases, strange phrases, written upside down, backward, sometimes in Latin. My brothers kept the orchard warm. Confession is not always verbal. The scarf was mercy. And then, most haunting of all, near the final page, the tongue must be stilled to preserve the name. The journal vanished after probate. Some say the family destroyed it. Others believe it was taken by someone inside the courthouse, a clerk perhaps who knew its weight. It doesn't matter. By then the curse had already settled into the marrow of the place. The Hall Mills murder wasn't just a crime. It became ritual. A rite of silence passed from one generation to the next. A reminder that beneath the surface of piety and propriety lies something ancient, something that hungers. Even now, the town avoids the orchard ruins. No one builds there. No one walks their dogs there. Children dare each other to touch the old stones at the edge, said to be remnants of the tree's roots. But few ever do. And those who do often return, changed. A girl named Lucy wandered out there once in 1983. A quiet girl, kind. After that afternoon, she stopped singing in church. Wouldn't speak of what she saw. She kept her hands clutched around her neck for days, as though shielding it from something invisible. Years later, she told a therapist in a whisper. They were lying there, still, but their eyes weren't dead. They were waiting, like they hadn't finished being seen. The orchard has a memory. The air tastes different there, thicker, and no birds nest in its trees, not even now. It watches. And what does it remember? Not just the murder, but the moments before it, the approaching footsteps, the sudden stillness, the breath caught in Eleanor's throat before it was taken, the pause before the blade was lifted, and Edward, turning to face what he knew he could not stop. These are the things no court could record, no journalist could print, but the orchard knows. And sometimes, if the wind is just right and you stand very still, you can hear the words that never made it into the letters, the real confession, the one whispered too late, the one buried not in graves, but in roots. In the years that followed, truth became less important than comfort. New Brunswick grew, the streets were repaved, the church was renovated, and in time, the faces changed. But some places remember, even when people choose not to. A custodian who worked at St. John's in the early 2000s swore that on certain evenings, when the choir was gone and the sanctuary sat cold, he could hear someone singing from the back pews. The voice was thin, cracked, female, always the same hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." But when he'd turned to look, the pews were empty, the doors locked. He left after 6 months, told his wife the building had too many memories trapped in the wood. There was a historian once, ambitious and bright, who tried to write the definitive book on the Hall Mills case. She spent years collecting artifacts, combing old records, piecing together the puzzle others had abandoned. Her name was Laura May, and in 2011, she announced on local radio that she had found something no one else had seen, that she was close to the heart of it. She was found 3 days later in her study, the manuscript missing, her laptop destroyed. A single page remained, torn and pinned to her wall with a rusted nail. On it was scrawled in her own hand. They knew what would happen. She brought the scarf. He brought the blade. It was not murder. It was communion. Authorities ruled it suicide. But her notes, those that remained, painted something else. She believed the orchard was not just a crime scene, but a chosen altar. That the letters were not confessions of love, but preparations. That Eleanor and Edward were participants in something darker than an affair. It's madness, people said, and maybe it is. But madness, like the wind through old branches, carries its own truth. What if Eleanor knew she was being followed? What if Edward saw no escape? What if the meeting beneath the tree wasn't a rendezvous, but a final act? A sacrifice, not to appease their guilt, but to preserve something sacred, something no court or scripture could touch, a kind of love that does not survive in daylight. There are those who claim to have seen the original police photos, now locked in a state archive, sealed from public view. One intern who broke protocol to peek said the photographs were wrong, not gruesome, not staged, just wrong. He claimed Eleanor's eyes were focused directly at the camera, that in every shot her gaze shifted slightly, that her hand, posed open, had something drawn on the palm, a symbol, a circle with a line through it, matching one found later carved faintly into the tree trunk. Coincidence? Maybe. But stories like this are built on the foundation of patterns we pretend not to see. In a basement of an old library downtown, still untouched by modernization, there's a ledger of births and deaths from the early 1900s. Most are routine. But between the pages for 1922 and 1923, there is a blank sheet. No ink, no entries, just one handwritten sentence at the bottom, scribbled in pencil. There are no records of ghosts. Someone, it seems, tried to keep it that way, but ghosts do not need names. They exist in gestures, a flicker of movement beneath a tree long since cut down, the sudden hush that falls when someone mentions Eleanor's name, the smell of lilac water when no one is wearing perfume, and above all, The lingering image of two lovers, lips forever parted, as though the final word never quite came. That's what the Hall Mills case became. Not just a murder, but an unfinished sentence, the last half of a whispered prayer. And those who speak of it, even now, find themselves swallowed by that silence. There was a reporter working on a retrospective for the centennial of the crime. His name was Benjamin Clark. Young, skeptical. He scoffed at the legends, called it small-town hysteria dressed up in romance. He disappeared in 2022, left behind a notebook. The final page said only, "The orchard is not empty." No body was found, but his car was parked near the edge of where the tree once stood. Doors locked, engine cold, keys inside. There are still nights when the church bells ring though no one pulls the rope. Still nights when the grave of Eleanor Mills bears fresh flowers though no visitor is ever seen. Still nights when someone driving past the orchard swears they see two figures, barely lit by moonlight, leaning toward one another, hands entwined, heads tilted in sorrow or in love, or perhaps both. We look for resolution, a name, a motive, a confession. But what if there isn't one? What if the answer isn't in who killed them, but in why we keep asking? Why their story calls to us across generations? Why in every version we feel their presence not as victims, but as something older, something tragic and holy? What if they weren't just murdered? What if they were martyred? Not for a cause, but for a question that still hangs in the air beneath the missing branches. What is love, if not the willingness to be destroyed in its name? That's why we return, not to solve the crime, but to walk its path, to step into the orchard, heart beating faster, to breathe in the hush, to hear the song, to find, in the silence, the echo of something once sacred, still waiting, still bleeding, still unanswered. Not all wounds bleed, some fester, some ripple outward, touching those who had nothing to do with the crime, at least not directly. And yet, in the strange architecture of a town's memory, guilt clings like mold in the corners of old buildings. You don't always see it, but you can smell it, feel it, taste it in the air. One of Eleanor's grandchildren, Margaret, was born long after the murders, long after the trials, long after the whispers had cooled into folklore. But even as a child, she knew not to ask about her grandmother, not to speak her name during supper, not to ask why her mother kept a single silver comb in a locked drawer, tied with blue ribbon and age. She grew up and left New Brunswick behind, but she never stopped hearing the silence. When she turned 50, she returned to the town for a genealogy project. Just a hobby, she said. Just a curiosity, but some roots pull harder than others. She stayed 2 nights at a local inn. On the 3rd, she disappeared. Her room was undisturbed, her clothes neatly folded, bed unslept, the comb was missing. They found her on the 4th day, seated on a bench near the Van Loo cemetery. Her eyes open, her mouth closed, hands folded in her lap just like Frances. She couldn't speak. For the rest of her life, she didn't speak. Doctors found no injury, no stroke, no cause. But her daughter said she would sometimes hum in her sleep, the same hymn, the one Eleanor sang. The orchard was never replanted. Developers tried, decades later. A housing project, a strip mall. Every attempt failed. Equipment would break, permits would go missing, investors would back out at the last moment. Finally, the land was purchased by the town. They called it green space, let it return to wild. But even the weeds seemed reluctant, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. One local historian said, "It's the only place in the county where grass dies in the shape of a cross every September." He was laughed off the council, but the photographs remained. The dead grass, always in the same shape, always in the same spot. Sometimes the things we don't believe are the ones that believe in us. There's a theory, quiet, unspoken, among those who still care to study the case. It doesn't live in books. It isn't taught in law schools, but it passes from one curious researcher to the next, like a prayer said under breath. The theory goes like this. Francis did not act alone. Francis did not order the murders. Francis watched and let them happen. The scarf, they say, was hers. She brought it, not to kill, but to bind, to muffle, to soften what was to come. She stood beneath that tree, alone or with her brothers, and she watched the man she loved whisper to a woman who bore his soul. And in that moment, something broke. Not out of rage, but out of devotion. Francis believed she was saving him, that the love between Eleanor and Edward was a sickness, a spiritual contagion, a heresy, one that had to be purged, not punished but ended. She brought no weapon, but she brought silence. She brought stillness. She brought the will to let it unfold, and in doing so became more dangerous than any knife, because she believed it was right. It's always the ones who believe in righteousness that walk most confidently into darkness. The court didn't convict her. The public couldn't prove it. But the land never forgot. Neither did the sky. And on rare, clear nights just before autumn, locals say you can see a shadow pass across the moon, like two figures leaning close, then pulled apart again by something vast and invisible. Something like guilt. Something like God. Even now, the Hall Mills case is used as a cautionary tale in criminology classes, a reminder of how public hysteria can corrupt evidence, how class and money distort justice, how truth is sometimes less valuable than peace. But those who teach the case never mention the orchard, never mention the scarf, never mention the comb tied in ribbon, because some truths are not academic. Some truths do not sit comfortably in textbooks. Some truths live only in the hush, in the unsaid, in the long pause between one breath and the next. There was a diary discovered recently in an attic outside town, believed to belong to a young maid who once worked in the Hall home. Most of the entries are mundane: laundry, church schedules, weather. But on September 15th, 1922, the entry is different. Just one sentence. Mrs. Hall did not sleep. She waited by the window all night watching the orchard. She knew. Whether she stopped it or not, she knew. And knowledge, once taken into the heart, festers if not spoken. Which is why she never did. Which is why we keep speaking it for her. So the wound does not rot deeper. So the roots do not climb higher. So the dead, whoever they were, whatever they became, are not left alone beneath a forgotten sky. Not all stories beg to be solved. Some only ask to be remembered. The orchard does not speak. It waits. Through every season, it waits. The leaves fall. The snow folds over the earth like a sheet pulled over a face. Spring returns, but nothing ever blooms where the tree once stood. Not fully, not freely. And yet people still come. They don't always know why. Some are students, some are writers, some are drawn by something they don't name. They walk the overgrown path, step into the hollow where the soil is soft, damp, darker than it should be. Some stay a while, others leave quickly, glancing back over their shoulder. Many do not return. Those who do speak carefully, if at all. I felt watched, one said. It felt like a chapel, said another, but wrong. I kept hearing breathing, whispered a third, and I realized it was mine, only mine, but it didn't feel like enough. There was a filmmaker once, an independent documentarian who came to New Brunswick to make a piece on unsolved historical murders. He pitched it as romantic tragedy meets true crime, but the footage never aired. He disappeared for nearly 2 weeks. When he reappeared, disheveled and hollow-eyed, he had no memory of where he'd been. His footage showed little, blurry images, wind, static. But in one frame, just a moment, there is the outline of a man in a clerical collar and a woman with a choir book, standing beneath an empty sky, looking not at each other but toward the camera. They vanish in the next frame. He never worked again. What draws us to this story is not just the crime, but its wound. It bleeds through generations, bleeds through sermons and songbooks and court transcripts, through bloodlines and bedroom walls and the breath of those who dare speak their names aloud. Edward, Eleanor, Francis, not saints, not monsters, just people. Flesh, fear, longing, devotion. But one of them died believing in something, and one of them lived despite it. And sometimes that's the greater tragedy. There is a sound people report hearing near the cemetery wall. Not weeping, not voices, but the sound of pages turning, fast, furious, as if someone is flipping through letters too quickly to read, as if trying to find the one that explains it all. We never found that letter. Perhaps it was burned. Perhaps it was never written. Or perhaps it is still being written, line by line, in every retelling, in every story, every whisper, every pause. Because the Hall Mills case never really ended. It drifts through time like smoke through rafters, through open windows, through the keyholes of locked bedrooms where lovers once met in secret. And though the orchard is silent, the house remains. The Hall residence still stands, not as a museum, not as a ruin, as a home, occupied, lived in, papered over. But beneath the fresh paint, beneath the carpets, there are floorboards that creak with the weight of memory. A faint scent of lilac clings to the corners, and in the upstairs hallway, at the hour just before dawn, there is sometimes a sound. Footsteps, not heavy, not fast, deliberate, as if someone is walking toward a window, waiting for a figure to appear beneath the trees. One neighbor says she's seen the woman. Every year on the night of September 16th, always at the window, always dressed in black, never moves, just watches. She says she tried once to wave. The figure raised a hand, and then vanished, not backwards, not to the side, just gone. The woman who lives there now refuses to speak of it, but every year she leaves the porch light on. Every year she places a single blue scarf on the fence, folded neatly, unmoving in the wind. We are not meant to solve this. We are meant to carry it, like a relic, like a scar, because somewhere between justice and forgiveness lies this story, waiting to be heard again, and again, and again, until the roots give up their secret, or until we finally understand. Some endings were never meant to come, only to echo, only to breathe. The diary never surfaced. There were rumors, of course. A leather-bound book said to be Eleanor's, filled with pressed flowers, marginal hymns, and phrases written sideways in trembling hand. Some said it was taken from her purse before police arrived. Others claimed it was passed to a bishop in Newark, quietly shelved in some locked ecclesiastical archive. But no one ever saw it. And so, in its absence, the world imagined its pages. "I love him," scratched between choir notes. "Away from here forever," circled twice. "Someday we will not need to lie." Whether real or imagined, that book became holy in its own way, whispered about in classrooms, pulpits, and late-night radio specials, as if the truth of the murder could be resurrected with enough ink and yearning. But truth is a different sort of corpse, one that shifts in the grave. That summer after the acquittal, the town tried to exhale. Frances Hall returned to her house unchanged but altered. She walked the rooms like someone wandering through a burned church, each piece of furniture a relic, each creak of the floorboard an accusation. She had been found not guilty, and yet she was not free. The eyes of the town did not leave her. They followed her down streets, through shop windows, reflected in silver spoons and teacups. She kept her gloves on, always, even in July. She stopped attending service, stopped opening mail. The roses in her garden withered that year, though the weather was kind. As for the brothers, Willie and Henry, no one asked after them. They melted into the background, like furniture long ago stripped of varnish. Men with money but not memory, with voices that no longer carried. And across the river, the Mills family shrank. Eleanor's children, left motherless, were raised in fragments, half-truths, whispers, silence. They grew up in a world where their mother's name was a ghost at the dinner table. A name said once, then never again. But some wounds don't fade. One daughter kept a portrait of Eleanor hidden behind a wall panel. She said she could feel heat radiating from it in winter. Another refused to sing hymns. Her voice is in them, she said. The house where Eleanor once lived became a rental. Strangers slept in the same rooms, unaware of the quiet grief soaked into the walls. Some left after a single night. One claimed the pipes sang in the dark, an unplaceable harmony, low and sorrowful. The priest who baptized Eleanor's son died suddenly the following year. No cause, just fell asleep in the chapel pew and never woke. Some say he'd been reading the Psalms aloud when it happened. Some say he wasn't alone. And then there was the orchard. It remained. Still, unchanged. Even when the rest of the city grew around it, roads paved, signs posted, power lines stitched across the sky, the little plot of land where the bodies were found remained untouched. Developers came, measured, drew plans, but each time, something happened. Surveyor equipment failed. Backhoes broke. One man collapsed without warning, hand pressed to the earth, whispering, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." They never built. They never would. Instead, the orchard became a kind of shrine, not formal, not fenced, but known. Children dared each other to touch the tree stump. Teenagers swore they saw Eleanor at the edge of the woods, mouthing something too quietly to hear. And older women, those who still remembered the trial, left flowers. Once a year, always white, always tied with a choir ribbon. No names, no notes, just memory. And so the Hall Mills case slipped not into resolution, but into ritual. A crime without an answer, a song without a final verse. It lives on in boxes, yellowed newspaper clippings, crumbling transcripts, photos with fading edges. But it also lives in breath, in the way someone pauses before saying her name, in the way a priest hesitates before walking through his parish at dusk, in the way we all in quiet moments wonder how far we'd go for love, or for forgiveness. We are not meant to know. We are meant to feel, and the feeling never leaves. Not fully, not even now. Because every time someone reads this story, they carry it forward. Every retelling is a resurrection, every whisper a reckoning. And somewhere, in the orchard that watches but never speaks, the wind turns one more page. Still searching, still waiting, for the truth that never came, and the peace that never followed. They buried her first. Eleanor's casket was smaller than expected, draped in lilies no one remembered bringing. The morning air was thick with fog and judgment. Some whispered, others refused to look at each other. Her children did not cry. They stood still as fence posts, stiffened by the weight of things they did not understand. Her face had been stitched carefully, but there was no way to soften the violence that had been done. The undertaker did his best. And still, the bruises showed beneath the powder. Still, the slash of her throat was not entirely hidden. Edward came next. His burial was quieter. The choir did not sing. No church bells rang, and even the clergy hesitated before opening their mouths. Because everyone knew, and knowing poisoned everything. Not just the soil, not just the pews, but the very foundation of what the town believed it was built upon. The Reverend had been a man of God. He had also been a man of secrets, and secrets, when unearthed, do not rest quietly. The newspapers fed on the chaos like starving crows. They circled the story again and again, picking it clean and reshaping the bones into something grotesque and ravenous. One claimed Eleanor's diary had been discovered. Another insisted Edward had been seen weeks before in the arms of a different woman. Photographs were printed, handwriting samples examined. The names of the choir club girls were dragged into the light one by one. It became a performance, a sick vaudeville, staged not in theaters, but in courtrooms and kitchens, whispered through gaslight and morning coffee, laughed about in bars and cried over in bedrooms, and still nothing definitive. No arrests, no trials, only speculation that grew teeth. The strongest suspicion fell upon the Hall family, not Edward's family, but his wife's, the Carpenters. Old money, cold power, the kind of family that understood how to buy silence and scrub blood from marble floors. Mrs. Frances Hall, Edward's widow, did not weep publicly. She stared, unblinking, as though grief were beneath her, as though rage had taken its place and was now housed in her spine. Her brothers, Henry and Willie, stood at her sides like stone gargoyles. Willie had a history of instability. Henry had a history of influence. Together they were dangerous. Rumors bloomed like rot, that Henry had hired men to follow Eleanor, that Willie had flown into a rage when he learned of the affair, that Frances had known all along and waited for the moment when vengeance could wear a pious face. And yet no charges held, no weapon was found. The crime scene, trampled and mishandled, offered no clarity, only symbols, a hat, a handkerchief, a torn page from a hymn book, and that haunting placement, their bodies arranged as if sleeping, facing upward, hands nearly touching. It was not just murder, it was theater. Autumn passed, then winter. Snow buried the crime scene in silence. But the townspeople remembered, and memory, once wounded, does not heal easily. Years later, when the court finally convened, it was not truth they pursued, but performance again, a trial staged for the sake of history, to make it look like justice was a living thing, even if it had long since died. Witnesses were called. Some vanished, others lied. Evidence was recited like scripture, though few believed it, and Frances sat in that courtroom, still, polished, unmoved, her face unreadable, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the mirror. In the end, they were acquitted. All of them. The Hall family returned to their estate. The Carpenters resumed their routines. The town exhaled, but it was not relief. It was resignation, because everyone understood something dark, something unspoken. Justice in this case had never been on the table, only performance, only preservation, of power, of name, of legacy. Eleanor's children moved away eventually. Edward's church was emptied and sold, the pews auctioned, the windows shattered by storms, the bell tower collapsed under its own weight. But the story did not die, because stories like this don't. They linger, in pages, in whispers, in that peculiar quiet that overtakes a room when someone dares to mention their names. And sometimes late at night, when the moon is thin and the air smells of iron, you can still feel it. That pulse of dread, that hush before revelation, that final note in the hymn that never resolves. The Hall Mills murder was not solved, because it was not meant to be. It was meant to haunt, and haunt it does. Still, the judge adjusted his spectacles and asked the jury to remember not what they read in the papers or heard whispered in the streets of New Brunswick, but only what was spoken in this room, under oath, under God. Yet even here, the truth shivered behind veils. Frances Hall sat poised like a statue in mourning, her black dress absorbing the light like grief absorbs time, and her eyes, those cold, hollow eyes, never trembled, not when the letters were read aloud, not when the bloodied calling card of her husband was presented, not even when the prosecution read the lines Eleanor Mills had written to Edward with such love that it almost bled from the ink itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," they said, "this was no mere affair of the heart, but a reckoning delivered with savagery and silence under the sacred branches of a churchyard, beside a fence where birds no longer sang." And yet the defense spun its own ghost story, one not of love and murder, but of persecution, of scapegoats and innuendo, painting Frances as a wronged woman, a wealthy widow hounded by rumor and scandal-hungry reporters, not justice. And then came the whispers again, the choir boys who claimed they saw nothing, The maid who suddenly forgot what she had once confessed. The neighbors who heard gunshots, or maybe just fireworks, or maybe nothing at all. The timeline fractured like stained glass, and every shard glittered with contradiction. On the stand, Willie Stevens was both child and man, his mind a maze of repetition and confusion, answering every question with a lopsided grin and a cryptic shrug, as if truth were a marble he lost long ago beneath the porch steps of his sister's house. And people leaned in not to believe him, but to marvel at the uncanny quiet around his words. Could a man like Willie plan a murder so cruel, so precise? Or was he simply a marionette in a crueler hand? The jury deliberated as the sky outside turned purple and thin rain needled the windows. Some said they saw the ghost of Eleanor Mills in the courthouse corridor, clutching her torn hymnal, her throat a seam of silence, her eyes pleading for a voice. Others said that justice was blind because it had to be. It couldn't bear to look directly at what had been done in that lonely field. And when the verdict came, it came not with thunder, but with a strange, soft finality. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And the air seemed to leave the room, and history exhaled a lie it would carry like a broken tooth for generations. But the case did not close, not truly, for even now in dusty police archives and yellowed newsprint, the echo remains, the echo of footsteps on pine needles, the rustle of hymn pages beneath a weeping sky, the unplayed notes of a broken organ. And in New Brunswick, when autumn curls the edges of the leaves and the river grows still as a held breath, you may hear it too. The voice that asks, not what happened, but why the silence still holds so tight. For the Hall Mills murders were not merely unsolved. They were devoured by something deeper than time. A ravenous hush that eats memory and spits out myth. And if you follow that hush long enough down winding alleys of hearsay and closed drawers, you might find something worse than the killer. You might find that in certain deaths, the truth dies first. And so the leaves turned once more, as they always do, over the quiet cemetery where Eleanor's grave still waits. Its stone chipped, her name fading under moss and wind. No verdict ever came, no confession whispered in the dark. Just the heavy silence of small-town memory, where gossip clings like ivy and justice dissolves like smoke. Perhaps the Reverend found peace beneath stained glass. Perhaps Eleanor still walks, her song unfinished, humming into the night. But what is truth when all the voices are gone? Only paper clippings remain, and those too are yellowing. If you listen closely, in the hush between the bells at midnight, you might still hear footsteps by the fence, a breath caught, a cry silenced by river fog. Because in New Brunswick, some stories don't end. They haunt, and if the shadows spoke to you tonight, if something forgotten stirred beneath the soil, then stay close. There are more secrets buried in time, more whispers waiting in the dark. Subscribe, and let the silence guide you back here, where truth is never simple, and stories are never really over.